If you ask the average person on the street, or honestly, even look at the consensus view on Wall Street, you're going to hear the exact same thing. Apple is a hardware company, right? They make the iPhone. But looking at this massive business strictly through the lens of a pure hardware cycle, well, it's becoming a dangerously narrow framework. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to absolutely challenge that conventional wisdom. We're putting on our senior macro strategist hats to unpack exactly how one of the world's largest companies is fundamentally rewiring its economic engine. So, is Apple really just a smartphone company? Treating them as a pure hardware manufacturer completely misses the point of what they actually do. Hardware is just the entry point. The reality is, Apple controls literally the most valuable consumer endpoint in the entire world, the personal device. Your iPhone is no longer just a product. It's your daily identity layer, your payment layer, your communication layer, your app distribution layer, and increasingly, it's your primary AI interaction layer. Okay, let's dive into this with a strict three-layer deep dive. First, the business logic of the door and the rent. Second, the financial reality of their services profit engine. And third, AI as the ecosystem glue, plus the major valuation and macro risks. Kicking things off with layer one, business logic, the door and the rent. This is the absolute fastest and most crucial mental model you need to understand Apple today. Think of it like this. Apple sells premium hardware. That's the door to enter their ecosystem. But once you walk through that door, Apple collects recurring rent from all the activity inside. The Mac, the iPad, the Apple Watch, AirPods, they bring users into the room. But it's the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple Care, and Apple Pay that turn that massive installed base into incredible recurring economics. The hardware gets you in, for sure, but the deep integration and brand trust generate the real long-term economic power. Here's how the Apple flywheel actually spins in the real world. It all starts with selling a premium device, which drives high customer satisfaction and just incredible retention. That massive, super loyal installed base acts like a giant magnet for the world's best developers, content, and accessories, which in turn generates recurring services revenue. Ultimately, this ecosystem stickiness is what supports those premium hardware prices for the very next cycle. The true moat here isn't just one killer feature, the moat is accumulated user habit. It practically forms an impenetrable fortress. To synthesize all of this, hardware is the door that controls the user relationship and creates the entry point. Services are the rent that deepen engagement and just print recurring revenue. And artificial intelligence, well, that's the glue that makes the ecosystem so highly personal that it becomes incredibly hard to leave. You see, this isn't just a product strategy. This is a highly sophisticated blueprint for capturing consumer value. Because the ultimate goal here, repricing loyalty. They are monetizing your trust and your daily habits on a recurring basis. Let's move on to layer two, financial reality, the gross profit repricing. To really prove this thesis, let's look closely at their fiscal Q2 2026 results. Apple reported a staggering total revenue of $111.2 billion. Let's put that in perspective for a second. They generated more revenue in a single quarter than the annual GDP of many entire countries. But top-line revenue only tells a fraction of the real story. If we break down that $111.2 billion, products revenue was $80.2 billion, while services revenue was $31 billion. Now, just looking at this on the surface, with products making up 72.1% of the pie, hardware still seems like the overwhelmingly dominant driver of the company. It's easy to see why people still call them a hardware business. But beneath that top-line revenue lies a massive structural difference in margins. Now, what's really interesting here is that products' gross margins sat at roughly 38.7%. Services, however, they commanded a phenomenal gross margin of approximately 76.7%. This is the secret engine of Apple's modern business model. It literally costs them significantly less to deliver a dollar of software or subscription revenue than it does to manufacture and ship a dollar of physical glass and aluminum. And because of that massive margin disparity, we arrive at the absolute most critical data point of our entire analysis, 43.4%. Think about this. Even though services only made up about 28% of total revenue, they represented 43.4% of total gross profit in Q2 2026. Almost half of the actual profit generated by Apple is now coming from the rent rather than the door. This drastically alters the entire valuation debate. The migration is just crystal clear. Apple is actively shifting from a cyclical hardware model where revenue depends heavily on consumer spending cycles and sitting on physical inventory to a recurring platform model. When you separate out the products and services lines like this, you can see that services gross margin is the clearest evidence that Apple has achieved recurring platform economics at a completely unprecedented scale. Which brings us to the valuation pivot. Cyclical hardware businesses typically get lower multiples on Wall Street because of the volatility of product cycles. But recurring, high-margin platform revenue, that commands an absolute premium. Let's dive into Layer 3, ecosystem glue and risks, AI's role and systemic threats. We really need to understand how Apple Intelligence cements this valuation pivot. See, they aren't trying to be a hyperscale cloud company renting out raw intelligence by the token, and they're totally avoiding purely ad-driven models. Instead, Apple Intelligence is designed to make devices profoundly personal and context-aware, all while leaning heavily into privacy. This does two huge things. It creates a super compelling reason for users to finally upgrade their aging hardware to newer chips. And it dramatically increases daily engagement with core ecosystem apps like iCloud, Siri, and Mail. AI isn't a separate product here. It's a retention layer. The traditional view, valuing them merely as a cyclical hardware company waiting around for iPhone upgrades, is fundamentally flawed. But to be fair, ignoring hardware cyclicality entirely is also wrong, because those services are still tethered to the physical device base. So the correct approach? It's a hybrid valuation framework. We need to view Apple as a premium hardware franchise combined with a high-margin recurring platform, with AI acting as the ultimate accelerator for both hardware upgrades and service retention. Of course, no macro strategy is without systemic threats. We have to do a quick reality check on the risks here. First up, there's iPhone cycle fatigue. If consumers decide to delay upgrades, top-line growth slows. Second, if Apple's AI execution lags behind consumer expectations, they could absolutely lose their innovation premium. Third, regulators worldwide are constantly applying pressure on the App Store's take rates and platform restrictions. Add to that the fierce local competition and geopolitical pressures in China, plus the ever-present threat of component cost inflation squeezing those hardware margins. So, bringing Layer 3 all together, their AI strategy is an ecosystem retention play, not a cloud token business. The valuation model requires blending the realities of cyclical hardware with the sky-high margins of a recurring platform. And the primary macro risks you need to watch are China geopolitics, regulatory actions against the App Store, and the elongation of device upgrade cycles. When you synthesize all three layers of this explainer, you arrive at the ultimate formula for what actually drives Apple's intrinsic value. Here it is. This is the true equation of Apple's future. Installed base, multiplied by user retention, multiplied by the average revenue they generate per user, and finally, hardware pricing power. Apple's next major thesis isn't that the iPhone is dead, not at all. The iPhone is still very much the door. The true thesis is that Apple is systematically repricing the loyalty of the billions of users standing behind that door. As services push past 43% of gross profit, this structural shift is already well underway. But as we look to the future of consumer tech, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Will Apple Intelligence simply be a defensive feature that stops them from falling behind? Or will it be the definitive variable that multiplies this entire ecosystem formula? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on that gross profit mix.